The modern habit of doing ceremonial things unceremoniously is no proof of humility. Rather, it proves the offender's inability to forget himself in the right, and his readiness to spoil for everyone else the proper pleasure of ritual. C.S. Lewis.
Bending, Not Breaking. Season 3, Episode 2. The Headband. And welcome back to another episode of Bending, Not Breaking. I'm Sunshine Mayfield.
And this is Ben Pruitt.
And we are so excited because we have a special guest. And I know we say that every week, but this time it actually is a special guest. It's not Max. We took a microphone away from our
Don't say
producer,
Max isn't special.
Well, he's always a special guest, but like we took the microphone away from him because we have another special guest. I'm not going to say a real special guest, another special guest.
There we go.
One of the phenomenal hosts of a podcast that Ben's definitely talked about a few times, and we've mentioned on the show before, Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. Ben, who do we have on the line?
Y'all, we have Casper Kuile with us, and I am so excited. Like, I'm a little giddy. I'm shaking a little bit because this is just such a cool experience. And so, Casper, you're here. How are you today?
Yay! Hi, guys. So great to be with you all. Yeah, I'm doing good. Thanks for introducing me to Avatar. Like, this is a whole new world for me. I'm very excited.
So you've never seen an episode before this?
No, I've heard people talk about it, and but I've never like dove in. So today was the day, and I'm excited to talk to you about it.
Well, excellent. So I'm glad we were able to convince someone to watch it because we've been trying to convince Max to watch it for 2 seasons now, and he still has never seen an episode.
Come on, Max.
We're excited. Come on, Max. So we're excited that you enjoyed it. Hopefully, we're going to be talking about this specific episode, The Headband, through the lens of ritual. And my understanding is that's a pretty significant and important lens to you. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm about to release a book called The Power of Ritual. So this is very much on my mind. I've been thinking for a long time about the way in which we build connection to one another, but also to ourselves, to landscape, the natural world, and also to the transcendent. And I've become really interested in not just kind of formal, like traditional religious rituals, but also very much the everyday rituals and how they can help us live a life of meaning. So, what can we learn from walking the dog? Let me say that again. What can we learn from pilgrimage about taking the dog for a walk? What can we learn about Sabbath, about turning off our phones? Because I think these old traditions have really interesting principles that we can apply to everyday life. And I was impressed, actually, that ritual was the theme for this episode because there was a lot of ritual activity in the episode that we watched.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you chose that specifically, but that was really well planned.
Yeah, I think it was roll of the dice. I think it was just it played out well. Especially, there's a lot of things, and we'll jump in. We'll do a quick recap of the episode. Ben, if you had to recap the episode in a headline, how would you describe this episode?
All right, my headline for the episode is Aang gets a chance to experience normal life ritual. Period.
That seems low. Normal seems like an interesting word.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe normal is the right word. Fire Nation ritual.
But ultimately, now, Casper, what was a moment, as someone who's never seen the show, what was a moment that really popped out of you out of the 23-minute runtime where you were like, oh, okay? What was a kind of a takeaway moment for you in the episode?
See, my headline would have been "Dancing Sets You Free."
Ooh, I love
so
that.
Much better.
That's so much better than mine.
So much better.
Yeah, I was really struck. We see right, all these school kids are very much kind of like disciplined. There's really no room for individual expression. And then Aang is our central character. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah. So he like is playing some sort of beautiful horn instrument in orchestra and can't help but dance as he's moving along, and realizes that this is something very unusual, and then kind of gets all the kids to come out to the cave where they're staying secretly and host this epic like dance party, which I feel like would have been not unfamiliar to my sisters who grew up much more rebellious than I did and would like go out to the forest with their friends and have like epic rages while I was at home studying.
Nice. Yeah, I was definitely the person at home studying too.
I was
in my
definitely the
family.
one out in the woods with the ragers. So it's
So that moment that you just talked about really stuck out to me too. So I kind of want to ask you a question about it. So it seems like Aang is so at one with himself and comfortable with himself. And this is true throughout the series, but it really appears in this episode. And so like he's so almost unaware of these social norms that he's experiencing that are pressuring him, and he's so unafraid of sticking out, and whether that's in music class, whether that's just in class, and it makes me like the emotion that kind of came up for me was like grief or sadness to think about the creativity that is being curbed by what may be ritual in our schools. And so I'm curious, like my question for you is, can ritual be
Right.
a negative thing? Tell me about that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, it's important to distinguish a couple of things here. I think, first of all, the direct answer to your question is absolutely yes. I mean, ritual is powerful, and it can be put to, very dangerous use. If you think about Nazi Germany, of course, as the ultimate example, you think about the goose stepping, you think about the military parades, you think about the language that was introduced to signify loyalty to the Führer, right? Like ritual is powerful because it moves us. But I think the school system is interesting because we see both ritual, but we also see habit. And it's important to make a distinction between those two. I think habits are things that we do every day, right? Brushing your teeth, putting on socks, hopefully, whatever we do habitually, just, run-of-the-mill stuff.
I'm hit or miss on both of those things.
Yeah. Yeah, I knew that was true. But I think there's a difference between, what takes something from a habit to a ritual is if we bring kind of an intention to it. If we're saying, you know what, I want to do this action because it will remind me of, this person that I love, or I'm doing this action because I want to feel connected to the place that I live in, right? Or I want to, there's some intention behind the action, and then there's attention paid to the action while you're doing it. So that's kind of step 2 is really being present while you're doing it. So it's not just, sometimes we listen to podcasts or we listen to music and it's just kind of background. That's not what I mean. It's a real sense of presence. And then the third thing is to repeat it over time. So you've got intention, attention, repetition. Those are kind of the 3 ingredients that take something from a habit to a ritual. So it was interesting for me to see some of the behaviors that you see in school, like, for example, Aang learns that you have to bow to your elders in the Fire Nation, right? This really powerful moment of respect. And it was interesting because I think in that first time, he's being introduced to it, and like literally the way he's holding his hands is not quite right. And so he's learning to do it. So in that moment, you could say, yes, is it a ritual? Maybe, because I think it'll become a habit maybe more than a ritual.
That's so interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Can you just repeat those, the 3 steps that you mentioned for us?
Yeah. So you want to bring an intention. While you're doing it, you want to pay attention. And then over time, you want to repeat it. So there's repetition. So if you think about, for example, a classic one might be, and I really want to say that I'm always interested in the everyday rituals, right? Like, yes, you can have beautiful, like, mountaintop ceremonies and, like, the most amazing, like, once-in-a-lifetime experiences, and that's fantastic, those peak experiences. But I'm really interested in the everyday. So one ritual that's been really important to me in my life is the idea of a tech Sabbath. So especially now with the news, there's kind of such overwhelm. I really try and just carve out a day every week from Friday night to Saturday night where I turn off my phone, turn off my laptop, and I light a little candle and sing a little song that I learned in summer camp. It's a Dutch song because I grew up speaking Dutch. And for me, it's become this really powerful ritual because it signifies this transition between kind of the work time and the time of rest. And I think that's when you have those that's really when you see the power of ritual. Is it kind of it marks a change. It somehow signals like something is different because we're doing this thing. That's really my favorite definition of ritual, is that it doesn't make things different, it makes things real. So it's really like it's pulling you in to the very kind of presence that you are. It's helping us be really conscious that we're alive, that this is the moment that we have.
I love that.
And it's interesting to me because if we're looking at him in school, if we're looking at ritual through that definition, saying the national oath every day is something that I feel like could be very intentional, where someone's paying attention and doing it for purpose. Maybe the teacher sees very deep meaning in that, but maybe the students don't. Or depending on the lens you're looking at it, going like, oh, that's kind of scary that they force kids to say that like every single day and pray to the Fire Lord. And so you're like, oh, that's more terrifying.
Yeah, in case you didn't catch on, Casper, the Fire Nation is the antagonist, essentially, in this series.
I got that.
Yeah, just to make sure.
Well, and it's so interesting.
Casper,
I thought it was really interesting that you see that kind of, the morning verse, as it were, or it was some sort of, communal saying, the Pledge of Allegiance, right? Like in a school context here in the US. You see that first, and then later you see a very clear narrative of the Fire Nation's history, which completely, turns out to be untrue, right? And Aang interrupts it and says, the Air Nation didn't have an army; it was a massacre. And so I think those two things are intentionally connected, right? Like that we're learning these words by rote, and then we're learning a history by rote, and neither one is really being given any air to breathe or interrogation to see if it's true.
So true. One of the biggest moments for me that pops out in the show is sometimes when I think ritual, I interchange that with tradition, and I don't know if that's always warranted. But and then when you get to tradition and you challenge it, the answer of "we don't do that here" is one that's incredibly personal to me. Both Ben and I, we've worked summer camps. And honestly, when you try to make changes where there's tradition,
oh boy,
people, we don't do that here, right? Like that's such a common answer. And so when you hear that in the episode, or when I heard it in the episode, it pulls a chord.
We were both taking notes at the same time, and we both audibly sighed.
And so how does that? What is the difference between ritual and tradition? And is there a right way to challenge those rituals or traditions? In moments like that, like we don't dance here. Well, we should, right? So how does that play into our own personal worlds when you get the answer from a friend? Oh, we don't do that here.
Well, it's such a beautiful question, because I think when we hear the word ritual, we often think, especially maybe religious traditions, right, or traditions that seem very stuck or stayed or unchanging. One of my favorite things to remember is that literally every tradition was once an innovation. And very often what people mean when they say it's a tradition is actually, it's what I grew up with. It's not necessarily true that it's much older. And we see the same in this episode, right? When they're like, oh, there's no dancing in the Fire Nation. And Aang is like, well, actually, I know some like old Fire Nation dances from like 100 years ago. And so he's uncovering the real tradition, which sits underneath this kind of veneer of like a fake tradition. So the first thing I always say is like, be very suspicious when people are saying, oh, it's tradition. That's not to say dismiss it out of hand, but to be skeptical of this sense of like, oh, we don't do things like that. The other thing to say is that, I think ritual, when it's alive, it's always changing, right? Because the culture and the historical context which it's in is changing. And I learned this from some wonderful Catholic nuns who were in their 70s and 80s, who were always thinking about their expression, and these are their words, their expression of religious life is a specific historical and cultural response to the gospel, a radical response to the gospel. And so if they're trying to hold on to something that was true 200 years ago, they're actually failing at their mission because they're not faithfully responding to that call in this moment. But it's very difficult for people once they're in charge of, let's say, a summer camp or a church where the safe thing is to do what we've always done. To then try something new is very scary. But I think real ritual, when it has a beating heart, and even tradition, when it has a beating heart, it is always changing. Otherwise, it becomes, it just becomes what we've always done. It's not actually alive and serving its purpose.
I love that idea and concept of it, like the vision of it being alive, of it having a pulse and it breathing, because that just is so in tune with every time I've heard that phrase of "we don't do that here," it feels like the breath has been sapped out,
right?
In a
it's
way.
Like a death knell.
Yeah, it's exactly right. Yes, and so I really love that visual. That's really helping me pin this. I appreciate that.
Well, I think we see it in the episode as well, right? Like when Anger's playing music, like he's moving, he's dancing, like it's so embodied, like literally the aliveness is in his body. And I think the other kids can't help but like be curious about it, right? Like they kind of want that too, and then they get it, and it feels fantastic.
So. Go ahead.
That specific moment to me, with the question I kind of wrote down was, does ritual stifle creativity? And now that we're talking about it, I don't think it does. I think there has to be an intention about how do you breathe life into creativity through ritual, rather than as a way of shutting it down because it's something that's different. Like if you have to move, just march in time and don't do anything else. Which is. Yeah, cause ultimately I go, all right, so if we're doing rituals all the time, how does that keep us from being our true, authentic, creative selves? Can it be a barrier?
Well, there is something
about it, yeah.
There is something in that, though, which is important. That it's very easy once you start talking about ritual, like, oh, it's great, it's cool, we should do it all the time. Like, no, it should be a time out of time, right? Like, we can't live in that reality all the time. It would be exhausting, right? Like, you can't have a dance party all day long, right? Like, you need times of normalcy and maybe those habits, and then you need special times. Like, I think about, if you think about a calendar, if you're traveling through the year, it's not a feast day every day, because then it's not special anymore, right? So you're gonna have normal time, and then you're gonna have feast time, and I think the same is true with rituals. Like, your day isn't going to be filled with one beautiful ritual after another. There's going to be some times where you just have to do the dishes or email.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to circle back to something we were talking about just a second ago that really reminded me of something that Brene Brown likes to talk about. There's a running joke on the show Casper where I mention Brene Brown in every episode.
Love Brene Brown.
But essentially, she talks about in The Gifts of Imperfection, one of the things that she talks about is how we have to laughter, song, and dance is integral to being wholehearted.
Yes.
And one of the things that I noticed in this is that those things were kind of being held back. And what Aang was doing is he was, as you talk about this living, breathing, dancing while he couldn't hold it back. It was alive. That's the visual that came up for me, because the vision that she brings up is she's when she says try to be cool, everyone folds their arms, holds back, isn't moving, and is still, and everything dies when you try to be cool, right? When you try to not be judged by your peers. And so it's really interesting for me to think about how ritual can get us out of that. How does that resonate with you? What does that sound like for you?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I want to say is I feel like, again, we see that in the episode. I can't remember the schoolyard bully's name, but we see this older guy who's physically strong, and he's got the girl, that whole setup. He is so challenged by Aang being on campus, being in the schoolyard. And the moment when the fight breaks out is when he's kind of inviting his girlfriend to dance, right? Like, it's that invitation to freedom, that invitation out of cool and into alive, that really threatens him, and he ends up becoming violent. This
love
traditionally masculine response, right?
You don't love that he's becoming violent.
No, that's true. Yeah, no, I love. Yes, thank you for the clarification.
I love when toxic masculinity rears its ugly head. It's one of my favorites.
Right, 100%. So I think we see it in the episode, but I really love that idea of needing to laugh and cry and dance, just to be human, and that rituals can help us get there. I think of Desmond Tutu says the same thing. Like, he tries to laugh and he tries to cry every day, and honestly, I think this is maybe what this points to for me, is that ritual in its ideal state often is social. Right? It's not something that we do just on our own, but it's something that we share with one another. And certainly for me, laughter comes easier when I'm with other people, right? And so whether it's a ritual meal, right, like just sitting down to dinner together and asking everyone what a rosebud and a thorn from the day, right, can be very simple. Or maybe it's time to maybe you buried a pet outside, or a loved one has passed and you want to remember them, and you tell stories about them and it brings a tear to the eye. Those are the things that ultimately are what life is all about, right? Like that sense of connection and meaning. So I think rituals are often like a bridge to help us get to that place. Often it's funny. I really believe in this idea that like you give the gift to the world that you actually most need yourself. And like, I'm always so resistant to ritual. I'm like, ugh, right, what are we going to do? This is so cheesy. Or like, no, I don't want to do it. And then once I'm doing it, I'm like, oh, actually, this is really great. But I think that's how it can help us. It kind of gets us beyond that, like, yeah, what you were describing, that kind of that chilly reception, or that sense of, emotional detachment and the cool factor, which ultimately you're just standing by the side of the room while everyone else is having a great time.
Yeah, I think two things kind of popped up for me, especially as Ang's trying to learn the cultural norms that are kind of set for him. Is one is there's a moment where he kind of gets invited into it. The girl shows him the right hand position that he's supposed to bow with, and and teaches him. And so, what's the importance of kind of being invited into habits or cultural norms? And then two, the other big one is there a privilege in being able to act outside of those, or to push back on them, as opposed to trying to fall in line and fall into that situation of like, I need to play it cool because there's a safety issue that could arise if I don't do that, even though you're not getting to be your authentic self.
Absolutely.
And so what is the importance of having someone invite you into the intention around rituals, traditions, cultural norms?
Yeah, this is actually one of the things that I'm most passionate about. And if the book can do anything for its readers, it's that I want people to feel a sense of spiritual permission. This sense that like you're being invited in, that you're being authorized to do something, that you don't, you have all the permission that you need to make rituals in your own life. I grew up without any sort of religious background. And as a gay guy, I was always very suspicious and hesitant about ritual and religion. And so for me to feel kind of invited in by some mentors, I had a wonderful mentor in the UK who said, hey, like, you keep wanting to lead people in song during these activist trainings. Like, what's that about? Let's discover what that is. Or, once I was in divinity school, professors who said, well, if these traditional sacred texts don't feel like they belong to you, why not explore, reading a text that does feel like yours, as if it's a sacred text, which of course we ended up doing with Harry Potter. So I feel like I've been given such permission by people who've kind of opened the door into a different way of thinking about the tradition. And I hope to do that, for folks through the podcast, through the book, through all my work, really, because otherwise it just feels like these kind of, I don't know, these ivory towers that are closed off, or these big grand cathedrals that don't feel like they belong to you. And I really want to kind of democratize that sense of meaning making, just like what you do on this podcast.
How do you kind of find spirit or in your everyday life? How do you find that thing that's meaningful, that gives you that same feeling, knowing if a church isn't that place?
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. And it's not always easy, you know. And I in some ways it's really interesting to see Aang in this episode because he lives this very unusual life, right? And he's entering into a school, and for everyone else it's like, oh, it's just another day with, you know, geography class or something. But for him it's this adventure because he just gets to be normal, exactly like you were saying before. And I think for us maybe it's more like the opposite, right? Like we live a day after a day after a day that can feel you know, pretty repetitive sometimes, and it's like, how do you find these glimmers of the divine, right? Like these sparks of really feeling alive in the way that you're like, oh yeah, that's what it's about. That's not always easy.
So what comes up for me as you talk is that moment towards, like, I think 3/4 of the way through the episode where Sokka is called normal, and it's like, what came up for me is like, it's hard to appreciate normal, our daily rituals, if you will, until they are disrupted or taken from us.
Oh boy.
So in the middle of our recording right now, we're recording in the middle of this pandemic, and there's this collective grief in our country and in the world, and it makes us like, man, I really miss going to work. I miss my drive because I got to listen to all my podcasts and I got to do all the things, and there's just this loss of ritual in a way. And I think that it's so much harder than to kind of rebuild ritual in this moment, because it's a completely new schedule with a completely different group of people. And like, what's your response to that? Because that's just where my brain is right now.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm curious, what are the things that you found that you're like, oh man, I really miss this? You mentioned, like, you know, the kind of travel to work and listening to podcasts. Like, what have been some other surprises for you?
Oh man, my love languages are physical touch and quality time.
Yes.
And so that is not what I am getting. Those are two things that have been severely disrupted. And it's so interesting to me because I think right now you're also dealing with this loss of ritual, and then you also start comparing levels of suffering, right? So like, I'm allowed to work from home, so I can't feel bad because so many people aren't. Ultimately that's not healthy either. Like that's not how feelings typically work.
You can berate yourself, but turns out you're still gonna feel them.
And so I think for me that's tough because you have to balance that. All right, so I'm losing ritual, but I'm potentially helping other people stay healthy. And then there's all these things that kind of bum me out, but I shouldn't be that bummed because there's definitely people out there that have it worse than I do. And how do I process all of this when these rituals, like my morning commutes where I get to put on my favorite album or podcast, like that doesn't happen anymore. And so it's tough.
It is tough. I'll share with you what my therapist told me, which was like, you know, don't be ashamed about the sadness that you feel. Right, like that. I realized I was like kind of embarrassed but that I was sad. And it. So I, you know, that's something I've been thinking about a lot. Is like the comparison of suffering is just a losing game from the beginning. It doesn't help anyone, you know. But on this sense of like the lost rituals, the thing that's really turned up in my life that I'm like, wow, I really miss this. My like weekly soccer game, not that I play, my team that I follow in the UK, and the international tennis season. Like honestly, when Indian Wells, which was the first like big tournament that they canceled a few weeks ago, was canceled, I just like had a little cry. I was like, no, because I realized I use sports as kind of a way of marking rhythm through time. You know, it gives structure to the week of knowing, oh, the games are going to be played on Saturday, then I listen to the podcast that comes out on Wednesday about the game, you know, blah 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 blah. And I think partly what it feels like for me, and maybe the same with you with the commute, is like it's this endless stretch of time, right? Like the traditional boundaries of like, we're in this phase, now we're in that phase, we're in this place, we're now in that place, like that's gone away. And so I think one of the invitations for us is to think creatively about, are there new rituals that can demark time together? So I've had more time at home with my husband than I've had in months, which has been lovely. And just being together while, honestly, he cooks dinner and then I do the washing up, while we cook dinner. That's kind of become my new anchor. And I think that's so important to like find the new rituals even amidst the changed world.
and then give those things intention, attention, and repetition.
Yes, look at that. Good students, A+.
We're learning. Things are happening. Well, it's interesting you mentioned cooking, because I honestly, that's probably the number one thing. Breakfast in the morning and getting up and actually having time to cook breakfast in the morning is not typically something that I do. And
Same.
It's something that I do every morning now. And it's typically the same. It's typically a version of eggs and
So good.
some form of a sandwich. But I think that's kind of been my new, like, all right, I'll sit here, I'll kind of decompress and get ready for the day, and that's kind of been my new normal for, as of right now.
Yeah.
So, are there other moments that were really popped out to you this episode where you saw Ritual?
Yeah, I mean, one of them, and this maybe is more an allusion to Ritual than actually seeing Ritual on the screen. But as our kind of heroic team is hiding from the Fire Nation, they're in this cave, and there's a couple moments where they gather around a fire. They're planning, what should we do? They're probably resting, they're eating, but it reminded me that ritual activity, gathering around fire, singing, dancing, these are things that predate our human capacity for language. And so to some extent, it's important for me to focus on ritual and kind of practiced behaviors, because so often we think about religion and spirituality as being about what you believe. And for most of the world, honestly, outside of kind of Protestant Christianity, ritual and spirituality is about what you practice. Like, what do you do? And so that moment when they're gathering around a fire, the community is coming together. It's just this, for me, it was this kind of symbol of like, we know how to do these things. Like, it's in our bones. It's in certainly our cultural DNA, but even I feel like something deeper in our genetic makeup of being human. We're social creatures. So I just love that moment, that image of the people we love, the community gathering around a fire.
I really think that's an interesting thought, because what came to mind is, like, how do we turn, like, our everyday habits, like, because I go to bed and I go to my room and I go to sleep in my bed, and how do I turn that into something that where I'm giving that intention and attention instead of just letting it happen throughout my day. It reminds me of the movie way back in the day, Adam Sandler, what is it, Click? Is that where he's able to fast forward through time, and he ends up fast forwarding through time, and then he loses that time altogether because he's only looking for the certain moments? And it feels like ritual helps you stay in the moment and not fast forward through time. Does that make sense at all?
Oh, I love that. I need to see that movie. That sounds juicy.
You really don't. It's
bad.
not a great movie. it's a fine to subpar movie, but the sentiment's great.
Literally, the value was being able to reference it in this conversation.
You just already said it. I love that. Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite ways of definitely setting that intention and helping to pay attention is just literally giving words to what's happening. So, if you think about getting into bed, one of the things you can just do is like maybe do like a little self-blessing and be like, may I sleep well tonight, or like, may I rest and wake up in the morning refreshed, right? Like tiny little words like that can actually make a big difference. The thing that I do, and I do this in the shower in the morning, like I broke both my ankles. I had a big fall more than a decade ago, so I have to do some stretches in the morning. So I do them when I'm in the shower. And one of the things I say to myself is, I might die today. I just say that out loud. And it sounds very grim, and it sounds kind of like, why would you want to remind yourself of your mortality? But it's really a kind of a modern version of a memento mori, right? This little moment of reminding ourselves that we are mortal and that there will be an end. And to some extent, of course, we're more reminded of that now than ever. But it's just a way of clarifying, oh, wait, today's precious, right? Like this hot water on my shoulders is precious. And it just kind of zooms in the lens, kind of like that click situation. And you're like, wait, this ordinary moment is actually remarkable. And so for me, that moment happens in the shower. It's fun. I've kind of experimented with things like this. So when I put my moisturizer on in the morning, I also say like, today will be filled with joy and suffering. And every day it turns out to be true. I literally had a day maybe like 2 months ago where I was like, dude, today's been just joy. And then I got a really like unfortunate email like at 10 p.m. and I was like, oh, there it is.
It always finds you.
Exactly.
And as when we're talking about characters that are looking for remarkable moments, I want to talk about Zuko as he's going to go speak to his uncle. Because for the first 2 seasons, Uncle Iroh's been there to give him life lessons,
unrelenting support,
and beautiful quotes, and just nonstop support and compassion. And then at the end of season 2, Zuko does him dirty, and
he crosses a boundary, right?
Yeah, that was set like, you need to stop doing this, right? And he crosses it, and now you can tell that Zuko's still searching for that normalcy. He's still searching for that wisdom and comfort, and the reaction from him when he does not get it is very visceral. And you can tell he's just searching for those moments of connection. And that to me is one of the most heartbreaking parts of this episode.
Totally. And you see him, you know, he comes back a second time, having shouted at his uncle. He comes back a second time and brings some food. And he starts off in this kind of like, I'm sorry, conciliatory, you know. And even then when his uncle doesn't respond, he explodes in this rage. And so he's clearly in this like volatile emotional state. And for me, the moment that touched me was seeing the uncle who doesn't turn his back, right? He stays facing against the wall, unwilling to look at Zuko. But you can see there's a tear in his eye because he's suffering amidst this enforced kind of separation moment. Yeah. One of the things that I think is really interesting is how intergenerational relationship can be such a powerful way of unlocking our capacity. You know, sometimes you actually need someone else to see what you're capable of before you see it in yourself. And I'm curious. I have no idea where the series will go, but I do hope we'll see some sort of reconciliation between uncle and nephew.
Do we ever? So I encourage you to watch the whole series.
It's so good.
It's pretty amazing.
Cool.
But Zuko's story arc is considered one of the greatest redemption arcs in fiction.
Whoa.
And so there's a
hope
lot
for
that
us
happens
all.
with him over. Yeah, there's hope for us all. Zuko's had a lot of trauma that he's experienced throughout his life. But I think how often are we searching for the miraculous in the mundane, right? How often are we looking for something to kind of show us that like there's purpose or value or a reason, and looking for that sense of either belonging or connection or anything to show that there's value to being here. And so I wonder how ritual plays into that because when you're working on those things within yourself, are you more likely to see that out in the world?
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, like, have there been kind of important uncle figures in your lives, like who've helped you kind of cross thresholds, or maybe helped you see something in yourself that you hadn't seen before? Were there mentors or teachers or elders in your life?
Yeah, 100%.
Absolutely.
I think of my 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Walker, who I don't think I could have done anything to make her raise her voice at me. She was always incredibly compassionate, and I probably deserved to probably
I'm sure you
get
did.
reprimanded frequently. But I nothing but empathy and compassion for her. And the juxtaposition to that was my 5th grade teacher was the exact opposite. And so it's incredible the moments that you can latch onto from your past of the really meaningful and the ones who kind of take that away. But I feel incredibly blessed to have supervisors, teachers, people that I was able to lean on over the last 30 years to help guide me to who I am today.
Yeah.
Ben, what about you?
I have a very similar, it's interesting that the first thought that came to mind was all of my teachers, and certainly not all of them, but I can name all of my teachers from kindergarten to now.
Wow.
And they're all had some sort of impact on me, and some certainly had more impacts. Like I still will get lunch every now and then with my 8th grade teacher, who was just incredibly impactful in my life. And then I still will go back and volunteer at my high school to work with some of the teachers that I got to had the joy of learning from. So just teachers in this mode have such an impact, and just makes me want to share some gratitude for all the teachers in my life, for sure.
One of my favorite kind of rituals to think about, because I always like to build on what people are already doing, is gratitude. Because I think more and more of us are, maybe we started a gratitude journal, or the classic is around the Thanksgiving dinner table, right? Everyone shares what are you grateful for, and it's. For me, what's so lovely is it's really an easy sell in terms of ritual, right? Like where your parents can do it around the dinner table with kiddos. It's not a complex thing. It's very approachable, but it's amazing how powerful it can be. When we bring to mind someone for whom we're grateful, and we really just try and be with them kind of in our mind's eye just for a few moments. I think about all the people working in hospitals right now, from surgeons to janitorial staff, just the incredible hard and dangerous work that they're doing to keep us all safe. If you really just allow yourself to sit in that gratitude, it transforms you. I become more compassionate, I become more understanding, I become more empathetic. And all I did was just focus on gratitude for a few moments, and it becomes all the stronger, if you write it down, or if you say it out loud, or if you act on it in some way by whether it's a gift or something else. Those simple rituals can really shift our mental state in very powerful ways.
So I am really curious then, because I think about doing that, and that seems to be a very vulnerable experience. Even just doing it with myself, and not sharing it with anyone, because it requires that I be willing to go to that place where I can admit that gratitude, and admit that I am where I am in life. And so what's your advice on that? Like, how do you grapple with that vulnerability and lean into that discomfort, and in order to even get to the part where you can embrace the ritual?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. And, sometimes I definitely have had experiences. I remember as a I think I was maybe 15, maybe 16. And I had been living in a boys' boarding house in secondary school. I'd been, away from my family in this very intense, we already talks about toxic masculinity. Like that was a very intense experience as a teenager, especially, wrestling with my sexuality. And I remember I came to live back at home, and I finally had my own room again. I'd been sharing a bedroom with 3 other boys with, Slipknot posters and half-naked models and like racing cars. And then my corner was like Agatha Christie novels and glitter pens. Like I was really out of place. And so to be back in a room where I felt really safe, not just physically, but psychologically safe, that this was just a place for me. I remember I kind of made up this ritual where I had these like essential oils, and I kind of like massaged the air around my skin. I was like, I'm just feeling, and I didn't know what I was doing, but I just burst into tears, and I think I just cried so much that afternoon, because it was just this stress of like 3 years of living in this, otherwise mostly fine boarding house, but I just never felt safe while I was there. It was just so intense. And so all of that is to say, like, you're right. Like sometimes when we do have the courage, right, when we're able to do something like this for the first time, it can really unlock something, and that's okay. That's really fine. My experience has been, and what I've understood from teachers, is that the more frequently we return to a practice like this, whether it's gratitude or meditation, right, the easier it becomes, or at least the more familiar it becomes. And so if it does, sometimes awaken tears, or sometimes it doesn't feel like much at all, we're not too worried about it, right? You're able to just experience it as it is without feeling overwhelmed by it, or frankly underwhelmed by it sometimes, because ritual doesn't always feel great. So I think, if there's a moment when you can feel brave enough, and maybe, just take some time to build up that courage, and say to yourself, okay, today is the day I'm going to try something new. I think that's a beautiful way to be gentle with yourself, but also to allow yourself to experience what's really true, what's really going on.
Whew. Yeah, chills. I just, those moments of, I think for Ben and I, this podcast is a way of creating a container. I think or trying to create a container for those,
Yeah.
those safety moments. And I think if there's a goal for our listeners, it's how do we create that container for others in everything that we do.
And that's what texts and stories have always been there for. That's why I love what you're doing with the podcast, because whenever we're talking about a text, and I don't just mean books, I mean movies, I mean even music, right? Like sure, we're interested in the story that's going on, but really what's most interesting is how the story is a mirror for our own life, and that we get to see things about ourselves and our own circumstance because we're looking so closely at the text. Like for me, I was really partly seeing this episode and feeling like, oh wow, a little bit of the loss and the grief of just seeing like the marketplace, right? Like just seeing people together. I was like, my gosh, actually I just miss that sense of sitting in a classroom and someone else being in charge and just like doing my homework, right? Like this, it always brings up the, it's we're not just looking at a story that's other, we're looking at a story that's our own through the text. So I love that that's what you're doing with the podcast.
Well, we got about 10 minutes left, and we want to be respectful of your time, but we always try to wrap up our episodes by looking at what is a weekly goal that we have going forward, but we try to do it through a specific element.
I love that.
This week's element is fire.
Yes.
No, sorry, air. It's air. It is air.
Also, yes.
Yeah. I messed up. And so, Ben, when you're thinking of the element air, what are some things that come up for you, just as we kind of recap this season, what air means when we say the element of air?
Yeah, so I mean, Aang's an airbender, and I think about all the things that he can do with that. He can fly, he can push out huge gusts behind him as a defense, he can shoot himself into the air, and he can even float on an air bubble and ride around like a little go-kart. And there's just so many things you can do, and part of me questions like the ritual around his bending and the ritual around like his everyday things, which to me seem extraordinary. And so what I'm feeling called to do is think of the moments in my life that are ordinary that other people might see as extraordinary, and then to feel gratitude towards them and kind of create some these moments of ritual where I can appreciate these ordinary moments that I may not appreciate now, but if I take the time to dive in, I might be able to sense that a little bit more. That's what comes up for me when I think about air and ritual.
Ooh, that's a good one. I think for me, when I think of ritual, I think of air being a tool, and similar to ritual being a tool, it can be used in a way that can power windmills and provide energy, but it can also tear down houses if it's not harnessed correctly, or if there's. And so, how do we use rituals and really focus on the intention of the rituals that we're doing to make sure that we're using those tools in a way that's going to be to a benefit to others and ourselves. And when we have these rituals, I think is what I feel called to do in my upcoming week. Casper, what about you?
I was so struck that I think the episode opens with everyone kind of floating in on this cloud. So I'm guessing he's airbending to make a cloud. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, he's got to hide the bison because a flying bison is a spectacle.
It's pretty obvious. Yeah. But I'm thinking about, right now, so many of us are being staying indoors as we should. And I live in the middle of Brooklyn, New York. I'm in the middle of the city, so we don't have a yard or a garden or anything like that. But what I do have is I can look at the sky. And so I'm thinking about how, especially over the coming week when I feel like trapped or like I can't do the things I want to do or frustrated, to try and like raise my eyes to the sky and to spot a cloud somewhere, that can be a little mindful moment of cloud spotting, and just to remember, like the clouds moving across the sky this time will also move, and who knows if we'll return to, in quotes, normal, but we certainly will be able to return to a different life. So that's what I'm going to try and hold on to.
That really just reminds me of the moments when I was a child where I would go outside and just
Right?
lay in the grass and stare
Right.
up. And I had a quote from one of my previous supervisors who I love dearly, who like gave me a really beautiful compliment once, where I was like I got really excited about bubbles, and she essentially was like, you're like, that's so childlike, and you
Mm,
are really, that's something that I really appreciate about you, and how you always
mm,
appreciate the things that seem normal, because I'm like, who cares about a bubble?
right.
And when I heard that, I still think about that every couple of days. It comes up for me. I'm like, I'm not appreciating bubbles enough, and that's what
Mm,
your goal this week reminds me of, is like, I need to
mm,
remember to appreciate the bubbles in the
yeah.
sky.
So many
Yeah.
things to be grateful for that we got to practice more gratitude, certainly. But that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that, Casper, and thank you for being on the show.
Oh my God.
You
Thank you
bet.
so much.
It is coming to an end. You are you have an invite whenever you want one.
Oh yeah.
Oh, thank
Anytime.
you.
We'll happily steal Max's microphone and give it to you.
Sorry,
Um,
Max.
But thank you so much for being here and doing this with us. And just again to shout out your book. Where can they find it? What's it called? And
You
all
bet.
the good info that comes with that.
All the good info. Yeah, it's called The Power of Ritual, and you can find it at powerofritual.org, which will link you to all the different places where you can buy it. And it's available in audio and ebook, of course, as well. And this summer, depending on how much we're allowed to travel or not, we'll either be touring 20 cities across the US for the book with the Harry Potter podcast, or we'll be doing online live shows for each individual city. So if you want to learn more, you can check out the live shows as well.
I'm pretty certain that I pre-ordered your book before it was up for pre-order on Amazon. And when you said, I remember like vividly when you were like, yeah, it goes up for pre-order. I was like, oh no, I said I already pre-ordered it. Did I pre-order the wrong book? And it turns out they just had it up early. But anyway,
They just had it up early. Yeah, you were in on the secret pre-order just for like
Yeah.
very special people.
no big deal or anything, y'all. But
Well, thank you all so much. Thank you, Casper, for being here, and thank you all for listening. Remember, you can follow us at BNB_pod on Instagram and Twitter. If you would like to support us, patreon.com/the Arc of E, and as little as $1 a month can get you bonus content and a bunch of episodes from our host site, the Arc of E Network. But thank you all so much for everything that you do and showing up each week virtually to listen. But Casper, thank you again for being here. And
I'm so grateful.
it was so cool.
Listen, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for creating this beautiful podcast in the world. And for everyone listening, you know that these gents are working hard to create this every week. So support them if you can.
I love him more now.
All right. Well, I'm Sunshine Mayfield.
This has been Pruitt.
And this has been Bending, Not Breaking. Thank you all so much for listening.